Welcome back to the Docker file options section of the Getting Started with Docker course. In this lesson, we're going to be covering entry point. This is actually the last item in our Docker file that we'll actually be covering in this section. Now, there may be a couple more things that pop up here and there that we might need, but for the most part, we'll now have covered every major thing that you'll get to use in a Docker file. So good news is we can now start using these things as soon as we get through this last one, the entry point. So let's get right to it and look for, what's actually right there, entry point. An entry point, essentially what it does is it specifies I'm going to run something, okay? And this happens when the container turns on. So at the end here, this last container, we could say entry point and then pass in some commands. So we pass them in square brackets, and we have our quotes, and let's just pass in maybe a ping command, which I'm not a huge Linux expert, so some versions of Linux can just run ping. Some, I believe, have to do like a /bin/ping. But we're gonna say that it's just ping is the command. That's gonna run out the command line. And well, it's actually gonna call it itself directly, and it will export to the command line. But we're not actually having to call the shell to do this. It's actually built in. So ping, and then we put a comma, and then any parameters we want. So for example, google.com. So we're going to ping google.com. Okay, so the first command is the executable or something to run. In this case, we're going to run the ping command, and we're going to pass in 0 or more parameters. In this case, I'm going to pass in one parameter, which is google.com. Is when we run this container, it's going to ping, and it's going to pass in the arguments, and this is the argument list. In this case, just one argument, google.com. So it's going to ping google.com. We haven't really seemingly changed anything, right? Well, actually, if we run this container, but we pass in an argument like this nginx, right here, we can pass in an argument and it overrides this command. So now what we can do is we can pass in instead a different domain. So you pass in bing.com, and that would override the command. Okay, so entry point is the default entry point, the default thing that's going to run when the container executes. Now, that's a pretty locked in thing unless you, on the command line, and I don't think they have an example of it here. But if you do, I believe it's just dash entry point, maybe dash dash, not positive. But then you can specify a different entry point, but that's pretty messy. But in general, this container will execute the ping command. By default, it will execute these parameters. That's the command. So we can override that by just passing in new parameters. So for example, if instead of nginx or nginx, but if I pass in instead bing.com, then it would ping bing.com instead of google.com. Now, how is this useful? Well, in some cases, we don't just say, hey, just turn on the machine and all's good. So a web server, in general, when we started this up originally, we just did the from and we did a copy, and that was it. And the reason we didn't have an entry point is because this version of Apache just turns on automatically and it's already serving a web server. And so we don't have to do anything. But sometimes we have an executable that we need to run when the container starts or something like that. For example, with .NET, usually you run .NET and then pass in your DLL to execute or whatever to execute, and it will execute that, for example, for a command line operation. Or maybe you want to specify it to run even a web server. You'd call the .NET command to run your web application. So there's possibilities there besides just saying, hey, what's ever already running in the machine, that's what's going to be running. With our entry point, we can say, actually, we want to kick this off. Okay, and here's what we want to kick it off with. Now, this is a simple example of ping, but maybe there was something a little bit more full-featured you wanted to do, and that would be what we use the entry point for. Now, in my .NET example, and let's just do it up here, entry point, we could say, the .NET example looks something like this, .NET, and then whatever my demo app.dll looks like. And so we're going to pass that in as an argument on entry point because we're not typically going to override that. That's always going to start with this container. And that my demo app could be a console app or it could be a web app. So that's what a .NET app will look like pretty much. Now, notice I have two entry points here. That doesn't really work. Okay, so if you have more than one entry point, which you shouldn't, but if you do, only the last entry point instruction will have any effect. So don't have two. Now, if you notice, in this documentation up here, there's two forms of entry point. And I didn't cover the second one yet. So I covered the first one with the square brackets and the quotes. But there's also this idea that we have another one depending on if you're in Windows or Linux, but that doesn't really pass the signals back. So it's not process ID 1, it will not receive Unix signals, and so you're not going to receive the termination signal from a Docker stop. So there's some definite drawbacks to using this second version, which does not have the square brackets. So in general, use the first method with the square brackets, and that is the preferred form. It's called the exec form. Okay? Now they have some examples here. Even if you wanted the shell or if you wanted the CMD, there's examples in here of how to call it somewhere in here. But essentially what you do is you call that as your entry point, and then you pass in your parameters. So you can still do most of these things, even with the shell, using this preferred exec form. So in general, try to avoid this style of entry point. Make sure you have your square brackets. Okay, so that's entry point. Entry point is whatever you want to execute when the container starts and any parameters that you want to pass along with it. CMD is any parameters you want to be defaults. So in this case, I have a default of google.com, but that can be easily overridden with how I pass in other commands. And that's all there is to entry point. So with that, let's go ahead and move on to the conclusion of this, where we kind of wrap up and summarize what we've learned, and then move on to the next section.